At 2:04 a.m., my phone buzzed. A biometric authentication request appeared, labeled System Maintenance. It demanded my digital signature, my own signature. I did not sign. I let it sit there, glowing against the dark. The room was silent except for the faint beeping of monitors. I felt my pulse quicken, not from illness but from recognition. This was no accident. Someone had gained access, someone who thought I was too weak, too medicated to notice. I pressed the phone against my palm, forcing myself to breathe slowly. If I acted too soon, they would know I was aware. If I waited, I could trace the hand behind the screen. My husband built safeguards into the trust, layers of security that only I could unlock. Yet here was the request, so polished, so precise, it had to come from someone close. Julian, my son-in-law, wore his virtue like armor. At every gathering he spoke of honesty, fairness, the sanctity of family legacy. His suit was always pressed, his smile warm, the very image of a dependable man. But I had long since learned that appearances are dangerous costumes. Behind the charm lay debts that mounted in casinos, late-night whispers over the phone, and the hollow look of a man running out of lifelines. The truth revealed itself in the most unlikely place, my hospital room. Because of my condition, my biometric credentials were linked to the hospital's secure network, a system designed to verify my identity whenever trustees required confirmation. It was meant to keep me safe, to ensure no transfer or access could be forged without my living presence. Julian had discovered this connection, and he had corrupted it. That night, the request on my phone was no accident. He had bribed a technician to insert a false maintenance update into the hospital's system, masking it as routine. If I had pressed approve, the vault containing the jewelry would have opened for him, every safeguard bypassed with my own unwilling hand. Weeks earlier, he betrayed himself. He lingered too long when I mentioned the trust's digital interface, asked questions about medical records and estate protocols that a casual son-in-law should never have cared about. His laugh was nervous, his gaze evasive, as though the weight of his desperation pressed from behind his eyes. By day, Julian paraded as a man of principle. By night, he was a gambler clawing for survival, willing to steal from the woman who had once welcomed him as family. He thought his mask unbreakable. Yet in the sterile glow of hospital monitors, I saw the cracks widen, and once a mask splits, it can never be repaired. The monitor beside me pulsed its steady beep, a metronome in the silence. I held the phone in my hand, staring at the request that glowed on the screen. Any ordinary patient would have panicked, rushed to approve, believing it was urgent, believing the word maintenance meant safety. But I was not ordinary. I whispered to the dark, almost amused. I have sat in boardrooms of the largest banks. I have signed transactions worth hundreds of millions. Did they think I would not recognize a counterfeit push when it blinked at me in the middle of the night? The longer I studied it, the clearer the flaw became. Real maintenance never demanded biometric approval at 2 in the morning. System updates were announced, documented, processed with layers of verification. This was a child's trick dressed in adult code, a desperate attempt to slip past me while they assumed medication had dulled my mind. They believed illness made me weak. They forgot experience sharpens the eye, so I did nothing. I let the screen glow, the false request hanging unanswered. My silence was not weakness, it was proof. Proof that I knew the difference between authentic security and a forged signal. Proof that I was still in control. I tightened my grip on the phone, feeling the cool edge press into my palm. Somewhere beyond these hospital walls, Julian waited for a signature that would never come. And in the quiet, I smiled. The jewelry was never just decoration to me. My husband left behind a collection valued at $120 million, pieces gathered over decades, each stone carrying history and meaning. He placed them in a revocable trust, a legal structure that allowed him control during his lifetime, yet ensured their protection after his death. Alongside that trust sat Schedule A, a formal list of assets attached to the document. Every necklace, every ring, every brooch was recorded there with precision. It was not some hidden stash in a vault. It was transparent, lawful, a clear reflection of his intent. I can still hear his voice when he explained it to me in his study, the lamplight soft against his tired face. These jewels are not for parties or vanity, Celine. They are the family's legacy. One day, when the time is right, they should belong to the public, resting in a museum where their story will outlast us. I remember nodding, not out of obedience, but out of respect. He had spent years curating beauty not for himself, but for posterity. To betray that wish would have been to betray the man I loved. That responsibility sits with me now. Whenever I open the trust documents, I see his handwriting in the margins, notes about provenance, remarks about which museum might honor them best. It is not about wealth I can touch or spend. It is about safeguarding meaning, preserving the dignity of what he left behind. My daughter and my son-in-law may see only dollar signs, but to me these jewels are far heavier. They carry memory, devotion, the weight of our shared years. I think of the generations before us, of how tradition weaves into stone and metal, turning objects into symbols. That is why I resist. That is why I cannot allow greedy hands to twist what was meant to be sacred. The jewelry is not mine to squander. It is mine to protect, until the day I deliver it to the place where light and history will guard it forever. My daughter, Grace, carried resentment like a shadow that never left her side. To her, the jewels were not symbols of history or family honor. They were glittering keys to the life she believed she deserved. I could still picture her frown the day the will was read, her voice sharp as she demanded why the jewelry had been locked away in the trust, instead of given directly to her. She called it selfishness, as if her father's wish to preserve them for a museum was a personal insult. She never understood that preservation was a form of love. In truth, Grace's world revolved around indulgence: new handbags, designer gowns, private getaways to the Riviera, tables in the most exclusive restaurants. She loved to post smiling photographs that hid the emptiness behind her eyes. The jewels, in her mind, were tickets to endless shopping sprees and champagne nights. Every time I refused her requests, the bitterness in her grew darker, her words dripping with disdain. I could feel her jealousy, a low burn that smoldered at every family dinner. To her, I was the barrier, the mother who refused to loosen her grip. She never saw herself as entitled, only as deprived of what was rightfully hers. And that quiet anger became the bond she shared with Julian. He needed the jewels for his debts. She wanted them for her vanity. Together their desires merged into one scheme. Grace, my daughter, once cradled in my arms, now stood ready to help steal from me. Julian had perfected the art of dual faces. In public, he was the polished executive, head of his own technology firm, admired for his speeches on ethics and innovation. At family gatherings, he never missed a chance to call me mother with syrup in his voice, the kind of sweetness that might fool anyone who wanted to believe in loyalty. He indulged Grace with effortless charm, swiping his card for designer gowns, spa retreats, champagne brunches. She mistook it for devotion, never realizing she was being kept dependent, her desires carefully fed so she would cling to him all the more. Yet behind that polished exterior was a hollow man drowning in debts. His taste for poker tables, for fast cars and shadowy pleasures had bled him dry. The smile he wore so easily at the dinner table was nothing but a mask stretched over desperation. I knew he saw the jewelry as his salvation. $120 million worth of gemstones could erase his creditors, restore his fragile empire, and keep alive the illusion that he was a successful entrepreneur. Without them, he was a man teetering on ruin. That is the truth of Julian. A hypocrite who wrapped greed in the language of virtue, a parasite who clothed his hunger in tailored suits. He wanted the jewels not for history, not for family, not even for Grace. He wanted them for survival and for the mask he could not afford to drop. And I watched him carefully, because a man who hides desperation behind charm is far more dangerous than one who shows his hand openly. The weakness in my body had always been a quiet companion, lingering like a shadow I could never escape. Heart disease and diabetes, they called it, conditions managed by medication and discipline, yet forever waiting to betray me in moments of stress. Grace and Julian knew this intimately. They understood that every spike in pressure could send a sharp ache through my chest, that fear and anxiety could tilt my balance and unravel my strength, and they chose to exploit it. At first, it was arguments staged with theatrical precision. They would shout across the living room, voices slicing the air, doors slamming hard enough to make the windows rattle. Grace would accuse Julian of neglect. Julian would answer with practiced fury, and though both knew I was watching, neither softened the venom. They wanted me rattled. They wanted the ground beneath me to shake. My granddaughter would hide her face in her hands, trembling at the noise, and when Julian turned his anger toward her, my heart cracked with helpless rage. Then the whispers began. Grace and Julian visited relatives under the guise of family concern. They told them I was unstable, that my illness made me paranoid, that I clung to jewels meant to be shared. They spun tales of selfishness, of cruelty, of a mother who had lost touch with reality. Slowly, those stories made their way back to me, carried by cousins who hesitated before repeating the poison. Aunt Claire thinks you refuse to see reason. Uncle Martin says you treat Grace like a beggar. Each word felt like a nail hammered into the wall of isolation surrounding me. The result was inevitable. I began to feel the stares, the careful silences at gatherings, the way conversations shifted when I entered a room. What had once been my family circle now pressed against me like a closed door. My chest grew heavy, my breath shallow, my pulse uneven. One evening, after another staged quarrel, the world tilted. My vision blurred, the floor dissolved beneath my feet, and pain ripped through my chest. They rushed me to the hospital, voices full of false panic. But I knew. This was no accident. This was the outcome they had engineered, the bed where they wanted me placed, vulnerable and surrounded by machines. Their plan had worked. At least that is what they believed. The night they brought me into the hospital, I felt my body betray me in ways I had long feared. The walls of the ambulance blurred, my chest clutched tight as if an invisible fist had wrapped itself around my heart. When the doors swung open and I was rushed inside, the world was reduced to fluorescent lights, cold hands, and the relentless beeping of machines. Tubes, wires, monitors, they became my companions, each one a reminder of fragility. For the first time in years, I felt utterly dependent, as though my life no longer belonged to me but to the devices keeping me alive. In that fragile state, vulnerability pressed down heavier than the pain itself. I could hear whispers outside the door, Grace's concerned voice pitched just high enough for me to catch. "Mother needs rest. We will take care of everything." Julian added his calm, reassuring tone, full of the false devotion he had mastered. They wanted the doctors and nurses to see them as dutiful family, the kind who sacrificed for my well-being. In truth, I recognized the triumph in their voices. To them, my illness was not tragedy but opportunity. I lay still, unable to protest, my strength drained. Every sound in the corridor seemed distant, muffled, as if the world had shifted beyond my control. I knew exactly what they were thinking. With me confined, tethered to machines, my signature could be forged, my authority silenced. They believed the jewelry was already within reach, and for a moment, I let them believe it, even as my resolve hardened beneath the weakness. Grace arrived first, her arms filled with roses that smelled too sweet, almost cloying in the sterile air of the hospital. Julian followed with a box of chocolates he knew I could never eat, smiling with the ease of a man who had practiced in the mirror. They stood at the foot of my bed, their words dripping with concern. "Mother, you must rest. We worry so much about you." Yet the sentences fell flat, like lines from a poorly rehearsed play. Their hands fidgeted, eyes darting away whenever I held their gaze. I listened, silent, watching the stiffness in Grace's posture, the way her smile wavered and returned as if it had been pinned in place. Julian sat beside me, patting my arm with exaggerated care, his tone saccharine. "We only want what is best for you." I almost laughed at the effort. Their affection was not affection at all, but a mask stretched thin over calculation. Lying there, connected to machines, I felt the layers of their performance peel away. Every word of comfort carried the hollowness of a script memorized. Every gesture reeked of obligation rather than love. In that moment, clarity struck me sharper than the pain in my chest. They were not hoping for my recovery. They were waiting for my weakness to grow, for dependence to replace authority. The jewelry was their aim, but I began to sense something deeper, darker. Perhaps they did not just want the inheritance. Perhaps they wanted me diminished, silenced, pliable. 2 nights after my admission, I noticed the IV bag hanging beside my bed looked different. The liquid was faintly tinted, not the usual pale clarity I had grown used to. At first I told myself it was a change in medication, yet no one explained it to me. The thought lingered, unsettling, as the slow drip slid into my veins. One evening later, near midnight, the door opened quietly and a nurse I had never seen before walked in. Her steps were measured, too cautious, her eyes fixed anywhere but mine. Without a word, she removed the existing bag and replaced it with another. The movement was swift, efficient, but her silence unsettled me more than the act itself. Every nurse I had met so far had spoken kindly, announcing their purpose. This one did not. I asked softly, "Who sent you?" Her reply was clipped, mechanical, a name muttered without confidence. My instincts sharpened. The color of the bag, the unannounced replacement, the unfamiliar face at such an hour, it all lined up like pieces of a puzzle. I lay still, memorizing every detail. Her narrow fingers adjusting the line, the faint accent threading through her words, the way her gaze avoided mine. A chill ran down my spine. This was no accident of hospital routine. Someone had placed her here, someone who wanted me weaker, quieter, easier to bend. My body felt frail, but my mind locked on one truth. The hunt had started, and I was no longer blind prey. I let my breath grow shallow, each inhale drawn with effort, each exhale trembling as though life itself were slipping away. Sometimes I closed my eyes for long stretches, letting my head tilt to the side. My lips parted as if I no longer had the strength to speak. The monitors still beeped their rhythm, but I allowed my body to seem frailer than it truly was. To anyone watching, I was a woman on the edge, too weak to resist, too lost to fight. Grace hovered with a mask of pity, her hand brushing my blanket as if in farewell. Yet her eyes gleamed with a satisfaction she could not hide. Julian leaned against the wall, his voice lowered to a whisper he thought I could not hear. "Soon," he said, "things will finally be resolved." Their vigilance slipped with every passing hour. Believing me defeated, they stopped curbing their expressions, their tones turning sharper, their words careless. I lay still, absorbing every detail. The way Grace's mouth curved in quiet triumph, the way Julian checked his phone, murmuring to contacts about papers and vaults. They thought I was blind to it all. But even behind closed lids, I counted every move, every clue. I let them believe I had surrendered, that the illness had consumed my will. Yet my mind was clearer than ever, sharper than the machines could measure. I whispered silently to myself, a promise etched into my bones. I let them think I had fallen. But my eyes were still open, quietly recording every truth. The camera was small, barely noticeable, tucked neatly into the corner above the cabinet where the IV bags hung. It had been installed at the request of my private physician, a precaution meant to monitor my treatment and ensure that no detail escaped attention. The hospital approved it, everything fully legal, a layer of protection I pretended not to know. But of course I knew. I welcomed its silent eye, for it would remember what others might try to erase. Grace and Julian never suspected. To them, the hospital was their safe arena. They believed money had already secured their advantage, that a few bribed nurses and a string of rehearsed lies made this room their stage. They carried themselves with smug assurance, certain that no one was watching except frail, half-conscious me. Their voices lowered only when staff walked by. The rest of the time they let their words slip, careless and incriminating. I remained still, listening, storing each syllable, while the camera captured everything. Grace's sighs of impatience, Julian's whispers about documents and access codes, even the moment when they argued over how soon the jewels could be transferred. All of it streamed quietly into a secure file beyond their reach. The irony tasted sharp in my mouth. They believed my hospital room was a cage, but it was a theater, and the audience was larger than they imagined. I closed my eyes, letting them believe I was asleep, while the camera's unblinking lens wrote the truth that would one day destroy them. Grace's voice cut through the quiet like a shard of glass. Thinking I was lost in fever or sleep, she leaned closer to the bed and whispered with venom. At last, Mother cannot hold on to what Father left. Her words carried both triumph and cruelty, a daughter's resentment sharpened into something far more vicious. I felt them burn inside me, yet I did not move. Julian sat beside her, his hand clasping hers, his smile thin and cold. Once the jewelry is in our hands, every debt will vanish, and we will be the true masters of this family. His tone was steady, deliberate, the voice of a man who had rehearsed his fantasy until it sounded like destiny. Their silhouettes hovered near, shadows stretching across the sterile floor, unaware that every syllable was being captured by the camera above. I remained still beneath the covers, each breath shallow but measured. My chest ached, not only from illness but from betrayal that cut deeper than any wound. Yet within the ache there was clarity. Their arrogance had undone them. In believing me too weak, they had spoken their truth aloud, crafting the very evidence that would one day seal their downfall. Julian could never resist the sound of his own triumph. Believing me unconscious, he leaned closer to Grace, his voice low but brimming with pride. "I have already bypassed the system. The jewelry now belongs to us." His words lingered in the sterile air, arrogant and careless. Grace's eyes widened, a mix of excitement and awe, and that was all the encouragement he needed to keep talking. He explained as though giving her a lesson, savoring each technical detail. I cloned the key, installed a counterfeit firmware update, tricked the server into believing it was routine maintenance. The MFA push went through perfectly. He spoke with relish, convinced his brilliance had sealed their victory. Grace nodded eagerly, her smile trembling with greed, hanging on every word. What he failed to realize was that every syllable was being preserved. The camera in the corner, silent and loyal, recorded not only his boasts but his confession. His explanations, meant to impress his wife, became evidence sharp as steel. What he considered a moment of triumph was, in truth, his undoing. I lay motionless, the mask of weakness still on my face, but inside I felt the tremor of revelation. They thought the hospital was their sanctuary, the perfect cover for deceit. Yet it was no sanctuary at all. It was the trap I had prepared, a room that had turned into a courtroom, each boastful word another nail in their coffin. Their arrogance had made them blind, and I, the silent witness, had just secured the perfect proof. My private physician arrived quietly that morning, his presence a rare comfort in the sterile chill of the ward. He checked the monitors, then examined the IV bag with a frown that deepened the longer he studied it. "This formula is not suitable," he murmured, his tone grave. "For a patient with a heart condition, it could trigger severe complications." His eyes met mine, and in that silence I heard everything he did not need to say. This was no accident. He reviewed the chart, compared dosages, and shook his head. Mistakes happen in hospitals, but this looked deliberate. His voice was steady, measured, yet it carried the weight of warning. I felt my stomach tighten, the faint suspicion I had carried now confirmed by a professional eye. What had seemed like paranoia was revealed as truth. Someone had tampered with my treatment. I lay back against the pillows, absorbing his words. The camera had captured their whispers, their arrogance. Now the medical proof stood beside it, undeniable. Grace and Julian were no longer simply scheming for jewels. They were manipulating the very fragility of my body, hoping my illness would finish what they dared not do outright. The weight of that realization pressed hard against my chest, though not with fear. It was clarity. This was no longer a game about inheritance or property. This was survival, a fight where the stakes had turned lethal. I closed my eyes briefly, breathing through the ache, and promised myself that if they wanted to play with life and death, they would soon learn whose resolve was stronger. Long before the ambulance lights carried me to the hospital, I had taken my own quiet precautions. The jewelry, every last piece of it, had been packed, documented, and shipped under my instruction to a secure vault in Switzerland. The arrangement was formalized through a bailment contract, legally binding, signed with precision. I held the receipts, the photographs of each item, the chain of custody that proved beyond doubt the jewels remained mine. No signature, no counterfeit, no scheme could undo that paper trail. What Grace and Julian did not know was that the vault in the house contained only replicas, crafted with care to mirror the originals, but embedded with forensic markings. I had left just enough sparkle to tempt them, just enough emptiness for their greed to reveal itself. By creating absence, I had built the snare. Their ambition would drive them straight into it. As I lay in the hospital bed, I thought of my husband's voice the night he entrusted the legacy to me. Protect them, Celine. They belong to history, not to vanity. I had promised him then, and I kept that promise not only through safeguarding the jewels, but also by letting the true thieves betray themselves. I closed my eyes, the faint hum of the machines surrounding me, and allowed myself a moment of grim satisfaction. They believed they were hunting treasure, but what they grasped was shadow. I had not merely preserved a legacy, I had preserved their downfall. At home, the vault no longer held the real jewels. Inside were only replicas, carefully made to look identical to the originals. On the surface they shined the same, but each piece carried hidden technology. Small tracking chips were placed inside, allowing their exact location to be followed in real time. If a necklace or ring ever left the vault, its path could be traced on a digital map within seconds. Along with the chips were microdots, tiny particles too small for the eye to see. Each microdot contained a unique code, a permanent mark that could not be removed. With special equipment, police or insurance investigators could confirm the code and immediately prove ownership. In legal terms, that meant no one could sell or display a piece without exposing themselves. The evidence was built into the object itself. Grace and Julian thought the vault still protected my fortune. They believed that opening it meant gaining the family's legacy. What they did not know was that the moment they touched a replica, they were already incriminating themselves. Carrying the items, showing them to others, or trying to sell them would automatically reveal their theft. I did not need to chase them or shout accusations. The vault itself had become the trap. Every piece of jewelry inside was no longer treasure to be stolen, but proof waiting to be activated. By reaching for what they thought was wealth, they would be proving their own crime. I called my attorney from the hospital bed and told him everything I had seen and recorded. He did not waste a minute. He prepared a preservation of evidence letter addressed to the hospital security company and to the maintenance contractor who touched the network. The letter required that every camera file, every entry record, and every system log be preserved in full. No edits, no deletions, no archiving tricks. He filed it, sent it by courier, and confirmed receipt with stamped acknowledgments. I have spent a lifetime signing weighty documents, but this one felt different. I could almost feel the walls of the corridor tighten around the scheme. The letter carried legal force. Once served, any attempt to alter the data would be treated as spoliation of evidence. Judges do not look kindly on that. Juries do not either. It becomes its own wrongdoing, separate from the theft itself. From my bed, I pictured the chain of custody hardening like poured concrete. The camera in my room, the access badges at every door, the audit trails inside the servers, each piece locked in place by law and by time. If a nurse tried to erase a clip, the gap would speak louder than any recording. If a contractor tried to reopen a ticket and rewrite the log, the signature of that tampering would be visible. I breathed a little easier as my attorney texted me that all notices were in effect. Grace and Julian still believed they could manage the story. They did not understand that the story now belonged to the records. I closed my eyes and rested. Another corridor had just closed, and I could hear the quiet click of a lock. The day my private physician returned, he carried not just concern but a thick file in his hands. He had reviewed the IV solution and the test results. His report was clear, written in language no one could misinterpret. The medication had been altered. It contained compounds known to destabilize the heart of a patient with my condition. This was not a dosage error or a mislabeled bag. It was deliberate, prepared with knowledge of my weakness. He explained each section to me, his finger tracing the pages. The charts showed levels inconsistent with any approved treatment plan. The lab results confirmed the presence of chemicals that should never have entered my bloodstream. The conclusion was stated in firm, professional terms. This was not medical negligence. This was intentional interference, consistent with attempted harm. As I listened, a calm clarity spread through me. Words could be denied, motives could be disguised, but science could not be argued away. The report would stand in court, unshakable, a pillar beside the other evidence already forming around me. I thought of the trust papers and the bailment contracts in Switzerland, the replicas embedded with trackers and microdots waiting in the vault at home. And now this, a medical document that named the act for what it was, an attempt on my life. For the first time since the games began, I no longer felt on the defensive. I had 3 weapons in my hand: legal proof of ownership, technological proof of fraud, and medical proof of assault. The walls they tried to close around me had become walls around them instead. I rested my head back and let the knowledge settle. The balance had shifted. 1 week after my days in the hospital, they held a lavish banquet at a 5-star hotel in the city center. The ballroom glittered under massive chandeliers, crystals scattering golden light across the marble floor. Strings played softly, glasses clinked, and polite greetings flowed in the air of high society. Julian strode to the center as if ascending a throne. A glass of champagne in one hand, he let his voice carry. "This is the family ruby, proof of the strength and glory of the Monroe name." He raised the glowing red stone, letting it catch the brilliance of the chandeliers. The crowd gasped, admiration spilling into whispers, their eyes fixed on him. Grace stood at his side in her shimmering gown, her smile stretched in satisfaction. Her gaze swept the room with pride, as if to declare her place at the center of attention. Inside, she believed her mother was finished, pushed aside, silenced, erased from the legacy. The guests applauded, their voices bright with approval, regarding Julian as the rightful heir. He basked in it, convinced every eye confirmed the crown he believed was his. The applause was still echoing when the doors at the end of the ballroom opened. I stepped inside, my movements slow, my body still showing the weakness of illness, but my eyes carried a sharpness that cut through the golden light. The crowd parted in whispers as I made my way forward, the train of my dress brushing the polished marble floor. Grace's smile froze. Julian's hand stiffened around the ruby, yet both tried to mask their unease. I stopped beneath the chandeliers, my voice steady, carrying across the hall. "Julian, that stone you flaunt is nothing but a replica, embedded with forensic chips of my own design." The words rang like a verdict. For a breathless moment the room fell silent, the air heavy with disbelief. The guests who had just been cheering now stared in shock, their admiration shifting into confusion. Grace's face drained of color, her perfect mask shattering. Julian forced a laugh, trying to steady his voice, but the edge of panic flickered in his eyes. He held the ruby higher, as if defiance could erase the truth. Yet I could see the doubt growing, the cracks forming in his facade. I stood tall despite my frailty, no longer hidden, no longer silent. The confrontation had begun, the stage no longer theirs but mine. The mother they thought discarded was standing before them, facing down the son-in-law who cloaked betrayal in virtue. And everyone present could feel that the room had shifted. The banquet was no longer a celebration, it was the beginning of judgment. The ballroom's golden glow shifted into a heavy silence when my attorney stepped forward. Without hesitation, he connected his laptop to the grand screen at the front of the hall. The chandeliers dimmed slightly as the first images appeared. The footage was grainy but clear enough to recognize every face. There was Grace, leaning over my hospital bed, her voice sharp with resentment. Beside her, Julian spoke with false confidence, describing how he had bribed a nurse, how the system had been bypassed, how everything was under his control. Then came the sentence that cut through the hall like a blade. Once the jewelry is in our hands, every debt will disappear. The sound of Julian's voice filled the space, undeniable, echoing against marble walls. For a moment he stood frozen, the ruby trembling in his grip. Grace's lips parted, but no excuse came. The guests began to murmur, their whispers swelling like a tide. Some covered their mouths, others shook their heads in open disbelief. But most turned their eyes toward Julian, no longer with admiration but with contempt. The applause that had once crowned him was gone. In its place was silence laced with judgment. I stood still, letting the images play, every detail reinforcing the truth. They had staged their victory, but the stage now belonged to me. The evidence did not speak in anger, nor in accusation. It spoke in their own voices, their own words, their own downfall. The screen went black, and for a breathless moment the ballroom held its silence. Then the doors swung open. Uniformed officers entered with steady steps, their voices firm and clear as they read the warrant. Julian Ashford, you are under arrest. Grace Monroe, you are also under arrest. The words rang through the chandeliers, louder than the music that had once filled the room. Julian tried to fight it. His voice rose, cracking with anger, shouting about lies and conspiracies. But the officers moved with practiced ease, forcing his arms behind his back, the click of handcuffs echoing across the marble. Grace broke then, her composure shattering. She fell to her knees, tears spilling down her cheeks, begging me to forgive her, calling me mother in a voice that was more desperation than love. I did not move. My fingers tightened around the glass of water I held, the cool surface grounding me in the storm. My eyes stayed calm, watching without pity, without triumph, only the quiet certainty that justice had finally shifted to my side. Around us, the guests stared in shock, their jewels and gowns now muted by the raw reality unfolding before them. The grandeur of the banquet dissolved beneath the harsh sound of steel cuffs and the blinding burst of camera flashes. What had begun as a celebration of false glory ended as a stage for downfall. And I stood in the center, steady and silent, while the illusion crumbled into dust. The night ended not with music, but with the hard glare of camera flashes. As Julian was escorted down the hotel steps, reporters crowded close, their voices a storm of questions. The police officers held him firmly. Julian's face was pale, his once practiced smile gone. He tried to speak, to summon the charm that had always saved him, but the words broke into stammers. The cameras caught everything, the sweat on his brow, the slump of his shoulders, the desperation in his eyes. The man once hailed as a model entrepreneur was no longer a figure of respect. He was the portrait of a criminal stripped bare in front of the world. Grace followed a few steps behind, sobbing, her cries drowned by the relentless shutters. No one rushed to her side. Guests who had once praised them now turned away, unwilling to meet her gaze. The luxury of the banquet hall, the golden chandeliers, the glittering gowns, all of it meant nothing now. From the window above I watched in silence. The cost of greed had revealed itself fully. Julian had lost not only the jewels he sought but the very image he had built his life upon. Honor gone, freedom gone, all that remained was the weight of chains and the judgment of the crowd. By morning the headlines had spread across every glossy magazine and digital screen. Grace Monroe, once admired as the graceful daughter of privilege, was exposed for conspiring with her husband against her own mother. The words betrayal and greed appeared in bold print, and with them her carefully crafted image dissolved. Friends who once invited her to luncheons in country clubs stopped answering her calls. The social circles where she had thrived now whispered her name only with contempt. The same women who had once praised her taste in gowns and jewelry now shook their heads in disgust, calling her a disgrace to her family. At charity events and galleries, her absence became its own statement. No one wanted their reputation tied to hers. The invitations that once overflowed her calendar disappeared. Behind the curtains of penthouses and estates, her name was a warning, not an honor. Grace had lived for appearances, for the flash of cameras and the approval of society. Now, stripped of that stage, she was left alone with silence. To the world, she was no longer the elegant daughter of the Monroe legacy. She was the woman who turned against blood for jewels she could never possess. For someone who measured her worth by admiration, isolation became the heaviest punishment of all. The fall of Julian did not stop at the banquet. Within days, the press uncovered every secret he had hidden. Reports detailed his gambling debts, the casino accounts drained of millions, the shadowy transfers meant to keep his company afloat. What had once been praised as a beacon of innovation was revealed as nothing more than a house built on lies. Shareholders fled almost overnight. Stock values collapsed, wiping out fortunes that had been tied to his promises. Partners who once praised his vision now rushed to cancel contracts, issuing statements of distance and regret. Inside the company, the employees saw the truth and walked away in waves, unwilling to tie their names to a sinking ship. Offices once buzzing with ambition turned silent, empty chairs lining the rows. The brand that Julian had paraded at conferences, hailed in magazines, and dressed in sleek marketing was now mocked as an illusion. What the world had thought was a thriving empire was exposed as smoke and mirrors, a hollow structure that crumbled in the light of scrutiny. As I read the headlines, I felt no triumph, only certainty. The world now saw him not only as a criminal in handcuffs, but as a man who had failed in every sense. His company gone, his reputation destroyed, his family ties severed. Julian had gambled everything on greed and lost. I walked into the press conference not as a victim, but as a woman who had endured and prevailed. Cameras turned, flashes burst, and the crowd fell into silence. While my daughter and her husband were buried under the weight of their own greed, I stood steady, a symbol of the strength they thought had vanished. Reporters asked about the jewels, and I told them calmly that the true collection remained untouched in a Swiss vault, protected under legal contracts and preserved exactly as my husband wished. His legacy was safe, not in their hands, but in mine. The public listened, and for once the story was not about scandal alone. It was about resilience. They saw that age and illness had not broken me. Instead, they had sharpened my judgment, teaching me patience when it mattered most and courage when it counted. What some mistook for weakness was revealed as the wisdom to set traps, to wait, and to strike when the truth would shine brightest. I did not raise my voice or seek applause. I simply stood with dignity, letting the facts speak louder than pride. Around me, the press captured every moment, and I knew the images would travel far. The tale was clear. Greed had destroyed those who reached for what was not theirs, while discipline and foresight had preserved both honor and inheritance. I returned at last to the quiet of my own home. No more hospital alarms, no more flashbulbs exploding in my face. I opened the door of the villa and stepped into a space that was both simple and refined. The silence itself felt like a luxury. On the table in the study sat a small box holding the records and contracts that proved the jewelry was safe in the Swiss vault. I touched it lightly, a reminder that my husband's wish had been fulfilled. With a glass of red wine in hand, I settled into the chair by the wide window. The city outside glowed in the colors of sunset, the sky burning orange before fading into blue. I let the silence surround me, the weight of recent battles slowly lifting, leaving only calm. My voice, in memory or in thought, spoke into the room. They believed illness made me weak, but wisdom and experience are walls no storm can break. I preserved the legacy, yet I cannot help but ask myself, is victory the same as happiness? The question lingered, unanswered, leaving the air open for reflection. Justice had been served, but emotion was less clear. What remained was not triumph, but the quiet balance after the storm. If this story makes you think of your mother or of your own aging, remember this. True worth lies not in assets but in respect and fairness. Protect your parents, protect yourself, and never assume that age means weakness. Share this story as a reminder that dignity and family bonds are treasures more enduring than jewels.